Hi everyone, it's Alex, and this is my September reading wrap-up. And I know that I mentioned also I wanted to do kind of a thing where I talk about the videos that I watched on YouTube this month, but I feel like where I read 11 books this month, I'll probably just do that video sometime this weekend as well and upload it separately. So starting off with Night Sky with Exit Wounds by Ocean Vuong, I find that it's really hard for me to review poetry because it requires so much of me reflecting on my emotions, which I hate. But I did enjoy this collection. I can definitely see where Vuong, he beautifully articulates these very specific settings like snow or running in a field. And I think a part of that is with describing his surroundings is to acknowledge his own limitations of his body, if that makes sense. Ocean Vuong is Vietnamese American and he's also a part of the LGBTQ community. So it's really interesting to see how he sort of talks about identity through these works, especially his interactions with men, including his own father. And I feel like what he does so well in this collection is there's this beautiful sense of restraint, but then there's definitely this sense of what I felt was like liberation or relief when I finished this in a very like empowering way, because there's a poem where he addresses himself at the end saying things like, loneliness is fine because it just means we're a part of the world. And I think that's something that he was struggling with whenever talking about these instances of his life as well. Another book I read this month was The Waves by Virginia Woolf. I already have a review of this on my channel, so I won't really talk about it that much, but I've also read Mrs. Dalloway and another work I'm going to talk about in a second. But out of the three I read by Woolf, this is my favorite by far. There's something so beautiful about all of these friends in which she's describing and how they interact with each other and how their lives change because of each other. And friendship is definitely a big theme for me, what I like to read about. The other Woolf that I read this month was Orlando, and this was really surprising for me because I was surprised how lighthearted this was. I didn't know that Virginia Woolf could like crack some jokes. This is a story about a man named Orlando who really just wakes up and becomes a woman. There really isn't an explanation as to how or why, but it's clear that Woolf is creating this sort of like satire on gender and how people make such a big deal about how people interact with depending who they are by gender. And I think I appreciate this much more whenever I realize the context in which this was written. Apparently it's with the Wolf. Not really what I read about wanting to make this public, but really it was for a friend, written for a friend, while also assumed to be a lover of Woolf's. This was a much more personal account of her personality through her writing instead of her published works. Although I will say the last 50 pages of this or so do get kind of heavy. It reminded me of the heaviness that I read when reading The Waves, and it's amazing because I didn't know that a couple years after this was written or published that The Waves would be coming out, and it's clear to see Woolf sort of beginning to think of writing The Waves and why. And I just love how that means that Woolf, to me, is a writer that's so much more concerned about how she's able to see the world through writing instead of writing to convenience herself, if that makes sense. So yeah, enjoyed Orlando, loved The Waves. I'm excited to read more Woolf. This month I also finished the Neapolitan novels by Elena Ferrante, and with the last one being The Story of the Lost Child. It's really hard for me to describe this series to people, but I'm gonna like link my Goodreads review down below because I feel like I do my best to articulate it there. But I mention in it that I feel like reading this work is like forgetting I was ever reading fiction, and I feel like I was trying to think, what is this one thing that the entire series is trying to encompass or talk about? And I think it's definitely that sense of losing one's innocence, whether that be losing your innocence whenever you first find yourself in a romantic relationship, or whenever you first travel away from home, or what it means to feel nostalgic about your home and where you come from. I swear by this series. It's going to be one of my favorite series of all time, so please read this if you haven't picked it up. I will say that The Story of a New Name, the second book in the series, is my favorite one, but it really ends so well, and I feel so rewarded and satisfied reading this series. I also read If You Knew Then What I Know Now by Ryan Van Meter. Ryan Van Meter in this series of personal essays talks about growing up gay in a very rural town in Missouri, I think, and I was much more gripped by this sort of first half or first act of the collection here because it talks about Van Meter's childhood, whereas the second half talks about his adult life and his romantic pursuits. And in that second half, I feel like something gets lost where it's not so much about self-discovery anymore, but it's about self-discovery through other people. And I know that for a lot of people in the LGBTQ community, it is a struggle to feel self-worth when it comes to finding someone romantically, and Van Meter certainly talks about those things here. But for me, I was much more gripped by the first half about self-doubt and wondering what these feelings mean being attracted to someone of the same gender. I think it's the very first essay in here talking about being on the back of a pickup truck, and just, I don't know, that first essay was great. I think it sets the tone incredibly well for this entire collection. I really enjoyed it, but the first half is definitely my favorite. Another essay collection I read this month was How to Write an Autobiographical Novel by Alexander Chee. Alexander Chee is Korean American and also part of the LGBTQ community, and I've been seeing this around, like on Bookstagram and on BookTube slightly, but I found myself really happy with reading this at the end. For me, the most interesting parts of this collection were whenever Chee was talking about what writing does to society, who sort of gets to be the storytellers of our world. And what I thought was really interesting is I had no idea that he studied under Annie Dillard in school. So I was much more interested in the writing process and all of the writing sort of craft stuff in here, more than I was about a random story about name dropping a celebrity that he loosely kind of met or became friends with in some hotel or something. But at the same time, I think those essays are sort of necessary to balance this because I feel like it sort of exudes Chee's personality. And he talks about his process of writing his first book, and I think it's so interesting. I'm a sucker for like on-craft writing books. I also read How to Be Alone by Jonathan Franzen. Now, I have not read Jonathan Franzen. I know he's like a very popular guy, and I know that he wrote The Corrections, which I heard is very good and I want to read. And with this collection, I thought it was going to be much more to like give me that feeling I had when I read The Lonely City by Olivia Lang, but this is much more, it's still societal like The Lonely City is through art, but this is much more about societal through technology. It's really amazing how kind of dated this collection is, mainly because Jonathan Franzen's concern is that a lot of us would find loneliness not too important, or at least reading not too important anymore, as technology began to like sweep the country in the early 2000s in a way that Jonathan Franzen, with his argument is that it feels like reading is like this exclusive thing that people don't realize is cool, but it's like depending what you read. And I get that vibe mainly because there was an essay in here about Jonathan Franzen getting his book on the Oprah list and how that sort of made him unhappy. At the same time, the essay was very good. I liked reading that one. And I also like the one, I think it's the very first one, where Franzen talks about his father's debilitating memory and his relationship with his mother. And I think when Franzen taps into more of his personal life, I think that's when he succeeds. And the other parts in here where it's more journalistic, I kind of sort of start flipping pages and sort of skipping sometimes. Moving on to short story collections, I read Will You Please Be Quiet Please by Raymond Carver. I mentioned in my BookTube Newbie 2.0 tag that I read this month and that I was kind of like stumped by it, and I still kind of am. It's because, surprisingly to me, these short story collections also required me to have a very strong emotional response to them. And that's mainly because all of these stories feel piloted by feeling. Not a lot really happens in them. Some of them are very short, but I think what Carver does really well is that he paints these very specific scenes, and they're quite haunting, I think. I think one of them was this woman praying on a bed and then the husband or something watching her do that, and it made me feel this overwhelming melancholy, and I think that's what these stories do. They paint mundane human life so well, but I can't tell if it's like in a brilliant way or if it's actually like reminding me a lot of whenever I read the short story collection by Ann Beattie earlier this year. If you've read Raymond Carver, please let me know what you think as well. I want to read more of him, but I'm still sort of like stumped by him. The second short story collection I read this month was Public Library by Ali Smith, and this is largely, I found the interludes in here very fascinating, where Ali Smith sort of rallies these people that she probably asked to like talk about libraries. Some of them are authors that we all probably know, and then just other people, and to me they all kind of sounded the same. But I'm happy to hear that people are so passionate about libraries, especially in the UK. I wasn't really aware of the situation going on over there. But thinking of the stories, I will say that to me, I feel like Ali Smith's strength is whenever she has enough time to really lay the foundation in a story and then really create an atmosphere with it, like how she does in How to Be Both. And I feel like these stories in here touch on feelings of connecting with other people genuinely. Like there's a story in here where I believe it was a husband trying to relate more to his wife because she liked to read a lot. All of these in some way are supposed to do with the power of reading or books, and I feel like in a way that actually hindered Smith and kind of served more as a crutch more than anything. I know that she has another short story collection called Hotel World, which I also own, and I hear about that one more, so maybe that one's a bit better, but I thought this collection was okay, and I think it's a nice addition to your library if you're a Smith fan, but I don't think I would start here. The last short story collection I read was Fresh Complaints by Jeffrey Eugenides. I've read The Virgin Suicides by Eugenides, and I've always appreciated how he's able to tap into sort of this human consciousness, a lot in the same ways that I think Woolf is able to capture that feeling between people and interactions. Although while I was reading these, I felt like the tone of them were largely so dispersed that I at times didn't feel like I was reading Jeffrey Eugenides all the time. And then I discovered in here, literally, it tells you when these stories were published, and some of them span a difference of like 20 years. And I will say that his most recent story is the last one in here, and I really actually think it's quite like controversial because it's very reflective of the Me Too movement. It's just, I don't know what Jeffrey Eugenides was thinking, because in the story it sort of paints survivor stories, mainly by women, as possibly not being either true, or maybe it's a satire on how our country, the United States, sort of doesn't pay enough attention to women survivor stories. But beyond that, some of my favorite stories in here were Airmail and Capricious Gardens. I think both of those really highlight how Eugenides is able to talk about how our desires also end up being projected onto other people, and how we don't understand those people because we don't realize what we're doing with our own projections. And finally, for this month, I have a graphic novel, and that is Skim. I find it really hard to describe this book. There's witchcraft in here, which I was not expecting, but also with Skim, it talks about a young girl who's navigating her adolescence while being in school, but there's also this like another storyline that's happening at the same time, is that at school it turns out that someone tries to kill themselves, and then another student does kill himself, and it takes on this tone that reminds me a lot of the movie Heathers. There's definitely some dry humor in this, which I really appreciated. I think it was definitely like this nice dose of reading that I got while reading sort of these heavier works. Otherwise, I will say with our protagonist here that I wasn't entirely captured by her, or really any of the characters. I feel like everyone was sort of on a flat line, as well as with the story, thinking of that. I'm not sure really what the message of this is, but it does give me that similar feeling of another sort of graphic novel called Ghost World that I love, and I love the movie as well. I feel like this is in the same realm, but for me it just wasn't as effective. So those are all the books I read this month. Please let me know if you've read any of these books. I would love to know what you think, and as always, I'll see you next time.